Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Positive Proof Podcast. I'm your host, Parmis Najmi, and I'm so glad that you're here. If you want to listen to more episodes like this one on self-improvement, mindset, and wellness, go ahead and hit that follow button to join the family. Before I get into today's episode, I just want to ask you guys for a quick and kind favor, and that is if you haven't yet left a review, I would absolutely appreciate if you could do so. It helps so much to build this podcast and help it grow so that we can increase the positive impact we make and just overall make it a bigger community. Also, if you are looking for daily motivation, follow me on Instagram at Positive Proof Podcast, where I post daily quotes that serve as sweet daily reminders. And if anyone is wondering how to leave episode requests, you can actually send me your thoughts via the DM me your thoughts link in the description or via Instagram DM as well. Now, if you're new here, quick little intro about me is I am freshly 27 years old, based in Toronto, and I started this podcast after a few big life shifts from leaving my 9-to-5, going full-time on a business, and just realizing I had way too much to say about self-growth, relationships, and becoming the woman I actually want to be. So I'm really happy you're here, and with that, let's get into today's episode. So a lot of us say we want growth. I know we hear it all the time, and we say we want healthy love, financial freedom, consistency, peace. And, we set the goals, we journal about them, we visualize them. And then the moment things actually start moving in the right direction, something shifts. We procrastinate, we overthink, we pick a fight, we pull away, we suddenly feel overwhelmed by the very thing that we were asking for. And it's confusing because on the surface, it makes no sense. Why would you sabotage what you prayed for? For a long time, I used to think self-sabotage meant a lack of discipline or maturity. I thought it meant I just didn't want it badly enough. But the deeper I've gone into psychology and the more honest that I've been with myself, the more I realized it's rarely that simple. Self-sabotage isn't usually about self-hatred, it's about protection. It's about identity. It's about your nervous system trying to keep you inside what feels familiar, even if familiar isn't necessarily healthy. So today I want to break this down in a way that's grounded and science-backed, but also personal. I want to talk about why we destroy what we say we want and what's actually happening beneath that pattern and how to shift it without shaming yourself into becoming someone else overnight. And before we dive in, a quick full check-in for those of you who are tuning in on Spotify. Scroll down and let me know if you've ever felt things going well and then suddenly created distance, doubt, or delay. Have you ever questioned something good for no good reason? If you have, I want you to vote in the poll below. Yes or no, no judgment at all. Now let's dive right in. Okay, point number 1, your brain prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar happiness. This is one of the hardest truths that I've had to accept about self-sabotage, and it's that, just as I said, your brain prefers familiar pain over unfamiliar happiness. And I know that sounds dramatic at first because why would anyone consciously choose pain, and why would anyone intentionally ruin something good? But the more I've studied psychology and, more importantly, the more I've observed myself in real time, the more I've realized that self-sabotage is rarely about wanting to suffer. It's about wanting to feel safe. Your brain is not really wired to make you happy. It is wired to protect you. The complication is that safe does not automatically mean healthy, peaceful, or fulfilling. Safe simply means familiar. If chaos has been your baseline, peace will feel unsettling. If you grew up in an environment where love was inconsistent, conditional, or unpredictable, then a secure and steady relationship might feel almost suspicious at first. If you've always pushed yourself to exhaustion in order to feel worthy, then slowing down may feel lazy or undeserved, even when your body is clearly asking for rest. This is not you being dramatic or overly complicated. It's literally neuroscience. The more we repeat a particular emotional experience, the stronger the associated neural pathways become. Your brain quite literally builds highways around the patterns that you've lived through the most. So even if those patterns were stressful, overwhelming, or painful, they still register as known territory. And known territory feels predictable. Predictability feels controllable. And controllability feels safe. That is exactly why when something genuinely good enters your life, like a healthy relationship, a meaningful opportunity, steady progress in your career, stability in your routine, your body does not always respond with ease. Sometimes it tightens, sometimes it overanalyzes, sometimes it starts searching for flaws that were not there before. Unfamiliar experiences, even positive ones, introduce uncertainty. And uncertainty can activate the nervous system in subtle ways. To your biology, unfamiliar does not automatically equal beneficial. It simply equals unknown. You may have noticed that when things start going well, you feel anxious without being able to identify a clear reason. You might begin nitpicking your partner, procrastinating on the opportunity you once prayed for, or convincing yourself that something is too good to be true. Those reactions are not random at all, and they are not evidence that you are incapable of happiness. They are just your brain attempting to pull you back into what it recognizes as stable territory. I have experienced seasons in my own life where everything felt genuinely calm and aligned, and instead of fully relaxing into that steadiness, I found myself searching for something to fix or to worry about. It was not dramatic sabotage, it was a quiet discomfort with ease. I had become so accustomed to operating in tension that peace felt foreign to me, and foreign felt unsafe. See, this is the layer that we rarely talk about. Sometimes we don't sabotage because we dislike ourselves. We sabotage because struggle has been woven into our identity. If you have always been the one who fights for love, hustles for approval, or proves herself through overexertion, then receiving love effortlessly or succeeding smoothly can feel very destabilizing. Your system becomes calibrated to intensity, and when life offers stability instead, it can feel almost disorienting, as though something essential is missing. The brain quietly whispers that this is not how survival has worked in the past. And what makes it even more complex is that this process is automatic. You don't just wake up and consciously decide to ruin good things. It appears in subtler forms. Overthinking, pulling away, picking unnecessary conflicts, missing deadlines, doubting yourself at the edge of expansion, or convincing yourself that you're not quite ready yet. These behaviors are misguided, but they are protective in intention. Instead of asking yourself why you always mess things up, a more productive question might be, what feels familiar about this level of peace, success, or stability? You might even ask what version of you would need to exist in order to sustain it, because sometimes self-sabotage is simply your previous identity attempting to remain in control. It is the part of you that learned how to survive under certain conditions, trying to reassert itself when those conditions begin to change. So I invite you to reflect gently on this. What kind of dysfunction feels strangely comfortable to you? Is it emotional unavailability, last-minute procrastination, or staying slightly overwhelmed because calm feels empty? And when things begin going well, do you find yourself creating small disruptions that pull you back into familiar territory? And if you notice that pattern, it's not proof that you're broken. It's evidence that your nervous system has been trained around a specific definition of safety. The first step in shifting self-sabotage is not forcing yourself into a completely different version overnight. It's recognizing that your brain is attempting to protect you using outdated rules that were once adapted but are no longer necessary. And once you see that clearly, shame begins to lose its grip. And when you remove shame from the equation, you create the psychological space required for actual real change. Point number 2, we're going to talk about cognitive dissonance and how you can't outgrow your self-image overnight. If the first layer of self-sabotage is familiarity, the second layer is identity. And this one is even more subtle because you can consciously want something while subconsciously resisting it if it does not align with how you see yourself. There is a psychological concept called cognitive dissonance, which refers to the discomfort we experience when our beliefs and our behavior do not align. See, your brain craves internal consistency. It wants your identity and your actions to match because that alignment feels stable and coherent. So if you've spent years telling yourself a particular story about who you are and your life begins moving in a direction that contradicts that story, your system experiences tension. For example, if deep down you believe you're not that disciplined and then you begin building real momentum in the gym or in your business, there's going to be friction. If you have internalized the belief that you are not the kind of woman who gets chosen and someone secure and emotionally available chooses you, that can feel destabilizing. If you quietly identify as someone who always messes things up and suddenly things are flowing smoothly, your brain begins scanning for the mistake. This doesn't happen because you secretly want to fail. It happens because success contradicts your established self-image, and contradiction creates psychological discomfort. This is often the point where self-sabotage quietly enters. You procrastinate on the opportunity you care about most. You miss small commitments that would reinforce your new identity. You downplay your wins before anyone else can acknowledge them, or you pull back right when someone begins getting close. Or you convince yourself you are overwhelmed when in reality, you're just expanding. All of these behaviors reduce the internal tension by pulling you back into alignment with the older identity. They restore familiarity and coherence, even if that coherence limits you. There's actually a quote that once stayed with me saying, "You do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your self-concept." And when I first heard that, I felt slightly confronted because I have always been very ambitious. I set high goals for myself and I value growth and expansion, but I've also experienced moments where behavior did not match the future I claimed I wanted. Instead of labeling that as laziness, I had to ask myself something a little bit more uncomfortable. Do I actually see myself as the woman who can sustain this level? Because there's a difference between desiring something and believing you are the kind of person who holds it naturally and consistently. If your self-concept is built around struggle, ease will feel temporary, almost like a fluke. If your identity has been shaped around proving yourself constantly, success may feel fragile rather than stable. If you have long described yourself as the awkward one, the overly emotional one, or the one who never finishes what she starts, your brain will cling to that narrative even when evidence begins to contradict it. Identity can be surprisingly addictive. Even negative identities provide predictability. They give you a script to follow and expectations to meet. So when you begin rewriting that script, you are stepping into unknown territory. And unknown territory requires growth. And growth requires vulnerability. And vulnerability requires releasing the version of you that once felt familiar, even if she was limited. Sometimes self-sabotage isn't rooted in fear of failure, but in fear of becoming someone new. Because if you're no longer the girl who struggles, then who are you? If you're no longer the one who chases or overextends herself for love, then who are you? If things genuinely begin working in your favor, what identity do you inhabit then? These are not surface level questions. They require recalibration of self-perception. There's also a dynamic that occurs when your external life begins outpacing your internal identity. For example, your bank account grows, but you still see yourself as financially unstable. Or your relationship improves, but you continue bracing for abandonment. Or your confidence increases outwardly, but internally you still label yourself as insecure. That gap between external reality and internal identity creates tension. And unless you intentionally update your self-concept, your behavior will gradually pull you back toward what feels psychologically consistent. This is exactly why affirmations alone rarely create transformation. You cannot simply repeat that you are confident, successful, or worthy if your internal blueprint has not been rebuilt through lived evidence. Identity shifts happen through small, repeated proof that you are someone different now, and they require consistency long enough for your brain to accept the new narrative as true. And that process, it takes time. So instead of asking yourself why you always ruin things, a more powerful question might be, what identity are you protecting? And what version of you feels safe because she's familiar? And what version of you feels expansive but slightly uncomfortable? The discomfort you experience when things are going well may not be a warning sign that something is wrong. It may simply be cognitive dissonance, the growing pains of becoming someone you haven't fully embodied yet. And once you recognize that, self-sabotage begins to feel less like weakness and more like an identity shift that has not completely settled into place. Moving on to point number 3, we're going to talk about the upper limit problem, why we ruin good things. So another layer of self-sabotage that I find incredibly revealing is the idea that each of us have an unconscious limit to how much happiness, success, love, or visibility we actually feel safe holding. It's almost like an internal thermostat that has been quietly set over years of lived experience, shaped by what we've normalized, what we've survived, and what we've come to expect from life. And when our reality begins to exceed that internal setting, so when things start going better than we're used to, there's often an instinctive pull to regulate ourselves back down to what feels emotionally manageable. And this doesn't happen dramatically most of the time. It happens subtly and almost invisibly. And you may have experienced this without ever labeling it. Life begins flowing in a way that feels aligned. You're consistent in the gym or focused in your business. You feel emotionally steady in a relationship, or there's a quiet sense of progress, the kind that doesn't scream for attention but feels grounding. And then almost inexplicably, you disrupt it. You skip the habits that were clearly working. You start questioning the person who has been treating you well. You create tension where there really wasn't any. You convince yourself that something feels off, even though objectively nothing is actually wrong. And it feels confusing because there is no obvious trigger. What's happening in those moments is not randomness or self-destructiveness, it's expansion colliding with capacity. See, growth stretches you in ways that aren't always comfortable. Success exposes you to visibility and responsibility, and love makes you vulnerable in a way independence never does. And when you begin stepping into a version of yourself that holds more responsibility, more stability, more recognition, your nervous system has to recalibrate. And if you've never sustained that level before, your body doesn't immediately register it as safe simply because it's positive. It registers it as unfamiliar. And as I said, unfamiliar experiences require adjustment before they feel secure. I've noticed this pattern in my own life during seasons that felt almost too steady. When my routine was consistent, when my mindset felt grounded, when relationships felt genuinely healthy, there was sometimes a subtle undercurrent of anticipation, like I was waiting for something to go wrong. And it wasn't dramatic sabotage and it wasn't conscious. It showed up more as internal restlessness, as a temptation to overanalyze something small or to raise the bar to an unrealistic level and shift from gratitude into pressure. Sustaining expansion requires emotional capacity, and capacity is something you build intentionally over time. It's not really something you automatically inherit the moment your circumstances improve. And what makes this particularly confronting is the realization that sometimes we don't fear failure nearly as much as we fear sustained success. See, failure is familiar. It confirms the old narratives we've carried about ourselves. It allows us to stay aligned with identities that feel predictable. Success, however, asks you to evolve. It asks you to release the version of yourself who hides behind inconsistency or behind the comfort of saying, I'm just not that type of person, or I always mess things up. And when you begin succeeding consistently, you lose the safety net of those stories. And that loss can feel destabilizing, even if the new reality is much better. See, there's a real identity shift required when you stop being the girl who struggles, when you stop chasing and start being chosen, when you stop quitting and start finishing. Growth removes excuses, and with that removal comes a higher level of self-responsibility. It requires you to fully inhabit a new identity instead of flirting with it temporarily and retreating when it feels too real. So sometimes when things begin working out in your favor, you unconsciously create friction just to bring yourself back to an emotional baseline you know how to manage. It might look like a small argument, a miscommitment, or a sudden wave of self-doubt. Nothing catastrophic, just enough disruption to shrink back into familiarity. But here's the part that matters most. The upper limit is not fixed, it's learned, and anything learned can be expanded. The discomfort you feel when life begins improving is not necessarily a warning sign. Often it's simply evidence that your capacity has not yet caught up to your circumstances. And capacity grows through repetition. It grows by allowing yourself to hold small amounts of stability, success, or love without immediately questioning or undermining them. The key is not to force yourself to leap miles beyond your comfort zone overnight, because that usually triggers an even stronger snapback response. The key here is gradual expansion, allowing your nervous system to acclimate and proving to yourself through lived experience that this new level is sustainable, that you can be consistent without burning out, that you can be loved without losing yourself, that you can succeed without it being taken away. When you begin noticing those subtle moments where you feel the urge to shrink, to disrupt, or to doubt, and you gently choose not to act on that impulse, this is where real growth occurs. It doesn't happen through grand declarations or dramatic reinventions. It happens in the quiet decisions to stay expanded, even when expansion still feels slightly unfamiliar. Moving on to point number 4, we're going to talk about self-sabotage as a nervous system response and not as a personality flaw. So up until now, we've talked about familiarity and identity, but there's an even deeper layer to self-sabotage that we can't ignore, and that's the nervous system. Because sometimes what you label as laziness, inconsistency, or being dramatic is actually a stress response unfolding in real time. Your nervous system does not differentiate particularly well between danger and significant change. Its primary job is to scan your environment for anything that feels uncertain, unpredictable, or potentially destabilizing, and then respond in a way that prioritizes survival. The complication is that growth, real growth, it contains all of those elements. It's uncertain, it's unpredictable, and it disrupts your current level of stability, even when it's moving you towards something better. The complication is that growth, real growth, it contains all of those elements. It's uncertain, it's unpredictable, and it disrupts your current level of stability, even when it's moving you towards something better. When you begin stepping into something new, even if it's objectively positive, your body can interpret that expansion as risk. Like a healthier relationship requires deeper vulnerability and emotional exposure. A new level of success demands more responsibility and visibility. A disciplined routine asks you to hold yourself to a higher standard consistently rather than sporadically. All of these shifts require energy, regulation, and resilience. So if your nervous system is not accustomed to operating at that level, it reacts automatically, often in ways that look like self-sabotage from the outside. And for some people, that reaction manifests as freezing. They procrastinate on the very tasks that would move their life forward. They scroll instead of executing. They delay sending the email. They avoid initiating the conversation. And on the surface, it appears to be laziness or poor time management, but biologically, it is a shutdown response. It is the nervous system signaling that the demand feels overwhelming and that retreat might be safer than action. For others, the response looks more like fighting. They become irritable or hypercritical. They pick unnecessary arguments. They fixate on flaws. They push away the very person who is treating them well. It presents as reactivity, but underneath, it is vulnerability and a subconscious attempt to regain control in the face of perceived exposure. Then there are those who flee. They quit projects just as they begin to gain traction. They abandon relationships at the moment they start feeling serious. They convince themselves they've lost interest when in reality, things were simply becoming real enough to require emotional investment. And there's also fawning, which can be harder to recognize because it often looks productive at first. Overcommitting, people-pleasing, saying yes to everything, gradually abandoning your own priorities until you're exhausted and resentful, eventually leading to burnout and collapse. All of these patterns are nervous system strategies. They're not personality flaws. They are protective mechanisms developed through past experience. This distinction matters because when we moralize self-sabotage and turn it into a character judgment, telling ourselves, I'm just inconsistent, or I have no discipline, or I always ruin things, we miss the opportunity to regulate instead of shame. The thing is, shame further activates the nervous system and reinforces that threat response. But regulation, on the other hand, it creates safety. There have been moments in my own life where I genuinely believed that I lacked discipline, especially when I procrastinated tasks that deeply mattered to me. But when I slowed down and examined those patterns more honestly, I realized the tasks I avoided were not the ones I was incapable of completing. They were the ones that just stretched me the most. And they were the ones that required visibility, accountability, and a more evolved version of myself to step forward. My avoidance was not about ability, it was about activation. And once you understand that, your approach shifts entirely. Because instead of forcing yourself aggressively or criticizing your own character, you begin asking different questions. You ask what part of this situation feels unsafe. You ask what you might be trying to protect. See, protection becomes the central theme because your nervous system learned its patterns through lived experience. If vulnerability once led to rejection, it will resist closeness. If success once led to criticism, pressure, or instability, it will resist visibility. If slowing down once coincided with loss or uncertainty, it will resist rest. So when you begin building something new, like a healthier relationship, a stable routine, or a more confident identity, your body has to unlearn those old associations. And unlearning doesn't happen through force. It happens through repetition and proof. This is why discipline without regulation rarely sustains long term. You can override your system temporarily through sheer willpower, but if your body still associates expansion with danger, it will eventually pull you back towards baseline. See, real change feels less like aggression and more like recalibration. It looks like catching yourself in a freeze moment and taking one small step anyways. It looks like noticing the urge to pick a fight and choosing to pause before reacting. It looks like feeling the impulse to quit and deciding to stay curious instead of retreating. It's the slow process of teaching your body that stability does not equal danger, that visibility does not guarantee rejection, and that growth does not automatically lead to collapse. When you view self-sabotage through this lens, it stops being evidence that you're broken or defective, and instead it becomes evidence that your nervous system is operating on outdated programming. And the hopeful truth is that the nervous system is adaptable. With consistent, safe experiences repeated over time, it recalibrates. It learns that success can be steady. It learns that love can be secure. It learns that growth can be sustained without catastrophe. But that recalibration only happens when you stop attacking yourself for the reaction and start understanding it with curiosity and patience. Moving on to the last point, we're going to talk about how you stop self-sabotaging by expanding your capacity and not by forcing discipline. So if self-sabotage isn't laziness and it isn't a lack of discipline and it isn't you being incapable, then what actually changes it? This is where I think most surface level advice completely misses the point. We're told to push harder, wake up earlier, cut distractions, want it more, try again with more intensity. But if self-sabotage is rooted in identity protection and nervous system regulation, then force alone will never create lasting change. You don't overcome self-sabotage by bullying yourself into expansion. You overcome it by increasing your capacity to hold the life that you say you want. Capacity is really the word here because if you don't have the emotional capacity to sustain peace, you will unconsciously recreate chaos. If you don't have the capacity to sustain visibility, you will shrink. If you don't have the capacity to hold success without panicking about what comes next, you will disrupt it just enough to return to familiarity. And the uncomfortable truth is that capacity is built gradually, not dramatically. It's built by allowing yourself to experience small, stable wins without immediately questioning them. It's built by finishing something and actually letting yourself register that you finished it. It's built by staying in a healthy dynamic long enough for your nervous system to stop searching for an exit. It's built by tolerating the discomfort of growth without interpreting that discomfort as a danger. I've noticed in my own life that the biggest shifts didn't come from intense reinvention or some dramatic personality overhaul. They came from repetition, from proving to myself quietly over time that I am someone who follows through, that I am someone who can handle calm, that I am someone who does not need emotional intensity to feel alive. And at first, I won't lie, it felt very unnatural. There were moments where consistency felt boring compared to the emotional highs and lows I had normalized in earlier seasons of my life. And there were moments where stability felt almost underwhelming. But instead of disrupting it, instead of creating a problem to feel stimulated, I let myself sit in it. I let my system acclimate. That acclimation period is what most people avoid. They want the identity shift without the adjustment phase. And if you've always been inconsistent, becoming consistent will feel strange before it feels empowering. If you've always chased emotionally unavailable people, being with someone secure might feel less exciting at first simply because your nervous system equates unpredictability with chemistry. If you've always operated in stress mode, rest can feel almost guilty. But discomfort does not automatically mean misalignment. Sometimes discomfort is simply expansion taking place in real time. So instead of asking how to force yourself to stop sabotaging, maybe the better question is how to expand your tolerance for good things. How do you expand your tolerance for being loved without pulling away, for succeeding without downplaying it, or for being seen without minimizing yourself? That expansion, it happens through evidence, not just intention, not just affirmations alone and not journaling alone, but lived proof. When you say you're going to do something small and you follow through, you're gathering identity evidence. When you resist the urge to create unnecessary conflict and instead choose regulation, you are expanding capacity. When you allow something good to continue without scanning for an exit, you are rewiring your upper limit. It won't feel dramatic. It won't feel cinematic. It will feel subtle and almost quiet, but quiet consistency is what fundamentally reshapes who you believe you are. And another piece of this that can't be ignored is also self-talk. Because if every time you slip up, you reinforce the narrative of, oh, I always ruin things, you're going to strengthen the old identity. But if you catch the pattern and say, I see what I'm doing. I'm trying to protect myself. That awareness interrupts the cycle, and awareness creates space, and space allows you to choose differently. I also think it's important to recognize that self-sabotage was once adaptive. It protected you at some point in your life when you didn't have the tools that you have now. It kept you inside familiar territory when risking disappointment felt unbearable. So it wasn't random and it wasn't stupid. It was protective. But you're not in that same season anymore. The version of you that learned to survive through shrinking does not have to lead your life now. What leads now is conscious repetition, emotional regulation, and gradual expansion. You don't need to leap into a completely new identity overnight. You just need to stay slightly longer in the version of yourself that feels aligned but unfamiliar. You need to tolerate the subtle discomfort of becoming someone new without running back to what feels known. Because maybe you're not afraid of failing. Maybe you're afraid of succeeding and realizing you can no longer play small. And when you understand that, self-sabotage stops feeling like self-destruction and it starts looking like a threshold you're now learning how to cross. So if you take anything from this episode, let it be this. Self-sabotage is not proof that you're incapable. It's usually proof that you're expanding beyond what once felt safe. And expansion can feel uncomfortable before it feels empowering. So instead of attacking yourself the next time you notice the urge to shrink, to pause and get curious, ask what you're protecting. Ask what version of you is trying to stay in charge, because growth isn't about becoming someone completely different overnight. It's about gently increasing your capacity to hold the life you say that you want. You don't need to leap. You just need to stay slightly longer in the unfamiliar version of yourself that feels aligned. Over time, that unfamiliarity becomes home. And when it does, I promise you'll realize you were never sabotaging your potential. You were just learning how to hold it. So if this episode resonated with you, share it with someone you love. And if you made it this far, I appreciate you so much. And I can't wait to chat with you again in next week's episode. Lots of love, Parmis.